are going to serve as a basis for better understanding um, the operation and the types of different firearms that we might encounter that are going to have some forensic significance. So let's get right into it. We see this term action. This was part of our basic definition of a firearm. So remember, a firearm is an assembly of an action and a barrel that propels a projectile through the products of combustion. So again, that sounds a little bit wordy, but let's start to look at what an action is, and that might help us understand that definition better. And we're just going to keep coming back to that. So an action is some sort of mechanical apparatus or equipment. It's some sort of device that's going to load, fire, and eject the cartridge. So notice that already we have another vocabulary word here, a cartridge. So we're going to see that in a little bit. And as we learn one word, it's going to help us understand the other ones because they all work together. But we're going to basically take some ammunition, we're going to load it into the firearm, we're going to fire it, and then we're going to eject the remains of that cartridge which was left behind. So here are some examples of types of actions: a bolt action, lever, pump, semi-automatic, and brake. There are others, and it does get a little bit more complicated than this, but this is really the thing that's going to do the loading, firing, and ejecting. Next, the barrel is pretty straightforward. It's generally a metal pipe, although it doesn't have to be metal. There can be other materials. It's going to guide the initial flight of the bullet. In other words, the bullet is going to travel internally through this length until it leaves. That's going to be really the internal ballistics. Then it's going to leave, and it's going to have external ballistics, meaning fly through the air and everything that can happen to it there or affect it. Then it's going to hit a target, and that's going to be called terminal ballistics. So there's different lengths, diameters, designs, shapes, and features that a barrel can have, but basically it's the pipe that the bullet travels through, and the end of that is called the muzzle. The breech is the end nearest the action. So again, the action is going to load, fire, and eject that cartridge. So right here, we see the breech end of this pistol. This is where the ammunition might be, and it's going to go down the barrel. Here we see it for this style. So right here again is the breech. The breech is going to be basically the back of the gun here. This area where it's going to be is going to be the chamber, and then you're going to have a firing pin to strike the base of that or the rim of it, depending on the type. And then eventually I have to extract this out and eject it. So the breech is the area closest to this mechanism right here called the action. Next, the breech block, sometimes called the breech face, is the back of the firing chamber. This is going to be significant because for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. Remember, again, our definition for a firearm. It's going to propel this projectile by means of combustion, a chemical reaction. In other words, an explosion. So we're going to ignite this gunpowder, and because there's no place for that pressure to go, because it's all contained, it pushes on the bullet. The bullet has no place to go but out the end of the barrel if everything's functioning properly. When that pushes the bullet out, the cartridge is left behind. They separate from each other. And that cartridge is what's then going to have to be ejected eventually. But in the meantime, as you have that explosion, it basically slams this backwards against the base of the chamber called the breech block or the breech face. That is going to be able to leave marks that are unique on the base of this cartridge that we might be able to match using some forensic techniques later. The bullet is the projectile. Sometimes they call this a round. Technically, that's not correct. A round is going to be an entire unit of ammunition. which is going to include the bullet, but also the cartridge, the primer, the gunpowder, and the other components. So this is the part that leaves the barrel of the gun is going to go on and strike a target. This is what gets scraped down the barrel, and that rifling, if it's present, is going to leave a scratch pattern on it called striations or stria, and those are the lands in the grooves of the barrel, or in this case, the impressions that they leave on the softer bullet going down the harder barrel. And we can then match these to the specific gun from which they were fired. Caliber is the diameter of the gun barrel considered in 1/100ths of an inch. Now, caliber, typically we're talking about it in inches, but we can also use the metric system. For example, a 9mm is going to be the diameter of the barrel for this. Okay, so we can see that as the numbers are getting larger in general, what we're saying about that is the diameter is getting larger. So a 22 is short for 0.22, 2/200ths of an inch. A cartridge now has multiple parts. Now notice here we're looking at two different types. One of them is really a shotgun shell, and the other one is a round of ammunition, most likely for a rifle or a pistol or a revolver. So what is the cartridge? It's the ammunition, and its parts generally are a casing, a primer, a powder, sometimes a wadding, and a bullet. So the bullet here is at the end, and it is what is going to detach from this casing and leave the barrel of the gun. Now, the casing is sometimes called the brass in case of say a handgun, and so that is going to have some marks that can be left on it as well. Sometimes scratches from the firing mechanism of the gun. In the base is the primer, and we've already talked about in a previous video that this could strike it in the center, and that would be called center fire, or it could strike it here on the edge or the rim, and that would be called rim fire. Center fire, again, currently is the most common type that you're going to encounter. So it's going to strike the center of this primer. The primer has a shock sensitive compound in it, so that creates the initial explosion that then ignites the propellant, so the powder, and then that powder does combustion now, the explosion, and then that pushes the bullet forward. The reaction is it pushes the rest backwards. This is the part that is going to slam against the breech face and can leave marks there. We're going to have a mark from the firing pin. We're going to have scratches on the bullet case, most likely, from a thing called the extractor, which is going to grab this casing and eject it or throw it out of the gun so that it can then load another one in its place. Now, again, there's some exceptions to that. For example, the revolver that we talked about is not going to extract it normally itself. Now, in the case of this shotgun shell here, this is often more of a plastic. This end actually tears open and is ripped open, and everything flies out from it. So in this case, we see little tiny, they look like BBs, little tiny balls. They are the shot. They can come in different sizes, or a single solid piece called a slug. In this case, a lot of times there's something called a wadding that's between the propellant, the gunpowder, and then the shot or the slug. So this can sometimes be paper, it can be a composite material, it can be a plastic. Sometimes these can be used to help identify the type of ammunition that was used. And then again, there's a primer. Moving on to the chamber. Here we see where the round of ammunition is loaded. So we have a complete cartridge. So here is the casing. Here's the bullet. Notice that the bullet fits snugly to the size of the barrel. The cartridge is typically larger than that. The cartridge remains behind. And where is that located? In this area called the chamber. The back of that chamber is going to be the breech face, and that is where the firing pin is going to impact it, either in the center or on the rim. So notice here, there's one in the chamber. They have opened up this slide action so that we can see that there's one in here and it's ready to go. So remember that we can load a magazine in here, which can have several rounds of ammunition. If you were to eject that magazine, you cannot assume that this gun is safe. You should always treat all firearms as if they're loaded, and you should never point it at something that you don't intend to shoot. So you may eject this magazine and wrongly assume that this gun is safe. In other words, that there's no bullet in it. And right here, there's still one in the chamber. That needs to be separately ejected. And because it wasn't fired, that's still called a live round. In other words, the primer's still intact. It has the capability of firing. The gauge is a measure of the diameter, typically for the barrel of a shotgun. So notice here that we have different sizes. Here's a 20 gauge barrel. What they're saying is it would take 20 of these to weigh 1 pound. Here is a 12 gauge. It would take 12 of these to weigh 1 pound. Okay, so this is gauging. The size of the opening here is called the bore. That's the diameter of this. So notice that the number of the gauge is getting smaller, but the diameter is getting bigger. And then we go down and we've got something smaller in size. The diameter is bigger. So we got 28, 20, 16, and so on. But notice that there's also a little bit different numbering system that can happen too. This is a 0.410 bore. So there is a little bit of change in the system here. The hammer is the part of the action that drives the firing pin into the primer. So some firearms, you need to cock or pull back this hammer, and then you pull the trigger, it releases the hammer, that comes down, the firing pin engages, it strikes that primer, and then it fires. Okay, so notice here we have a couple of terms here: single action and double action. And so those operate a little bit differently, and we will talk about those later. There's also another method called striker fire. So there's a hammer in some cases, and then there's an internal mechanism called striker fire. Lands and grooves. Again, we've talked about this. This is that spiral pattern internally within the barrel that is going to spin the bullet, and it has these raised marks called lands and indentations called grooves. The diameter of this is the caliber. The magazine is the device for holding all of the cartridges, so all of the live rounds of ammunition. There are different types of that. We mentioned in the last set of notes that a clip is not technically the same thing as the magazine. A clip is used to help quickly load a magazine. So yes, it can hold it, but it's not by itself what is used. Magnum is a term that we sometimes see. It's a type of cartridge that contains more than what's considered the standard amount of powder, and so it results in more power to the bullet. More gunpowder means bigger explosion. Bigger explosion means more power to the bullet. This is a 357 Magnum. 357 refers to the caliper. So if you put a decimal point in front of this, it's a 0.357 inches in diameter. That's the general concept. You see some other terms here too. 158 GRS, that stands for grains. That has to deal with the gunpowder itself. The muzzle is the opening of the gun barrel where the bullet exits. So there's a nice picture of this. This is something you never want to see. You do not want to be looking down the barrel of a gun. You always want to treat it as if it's loaded. But in this case, they've taken a picture for us. Powder is the solid explosive used to propel the bullet. In the first set of notes we did is we talked about the history of it. We mentioned that it's composed of charcoal, potassium nitrate, and sulfur. These can be chemically tested for in gunshot residue to determine if gunpowder was present on someone's clothes, their hands, their face, elsewhere in the room. Okay, so we've got the bullet, the powder, the casing. The primer is that shock-sensitive compound that's going to ignite the main charge. So again, the primer is in the base here. The firing pin can strike it in the center fire, or the edge, rim fire, but it ignites that material, which is then going to further ignite the gunpowder and then propel the bullet on its way. Rifling itself are the spiral grooves. They can be spiral or polygonal, in other words, a polygon shape. We talked about that in the last set of notes. Here's a barrel, and they've cut it open for us. So normally it would go all the way around, but we see a little bit of that. And we again can see that twist that it has to it to spin that bullet. The sight is usually on top of the gun. It helps improve aim. So there can be a front sight and a rear sight. There are a lot of different types of sights. So just in general, all you really need to know about it is that it's used to aim the gun to be more accurate. A silencer is placed over the muzzle and reduces the noise emitted from the weapon. So the name can be misleading. It isn't necessarily silent, as in there is no sound whatsoever, but it greatly reduces the noise. In general, silencers tend to be illegal. Even owning a part of a silencer, in New York State at least, tends to be illegal. That's another whole nother issue, but for here, this is a silencer. Other things could be used in a forensics case to reduce the sound. Often they could fire into something like a pillow. They could attach a bottle here, like a Mountain Dew bottle, and they could make their own silencer from home parts that would reduce the sound. So you sometimes see those things as well. So you might find a discarded soda bottle at the scene of a crime and it's damaged. That could be very significant evidence. That could have been the homemade silencer that was left behind. The stock is the frame that holds the barrel and the action together. So again, what was our definition for a firearm? It was an assembly of an action and a barrel. What holds that action, which is going to load, fire, and eject that ammunition, and the barrel together. That's the frame. And there are lots of different types of frames that can do this. We have the butt end of here. Generally, this part's the stock, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Sometimes they have different grips, like a pistol grip. There are things called bump stocks. We'll talk about those more later. Bump stock gets a little bit more complicated. And now we're on to ammunition. So that's where we're going to end with this set of notes today. I would recommend familiarizing yourself with those 20 terms. It's going to help you a lot in your understanding of this topic.